Hello and welcome to this webinar. My name is Maria João Gaspar and I belong to the coordination team of do Centro de Competências do Pinheiro-Bravo, and I will moderate this session. O Centro de Competências do Pinheiro-Bravo is a Portuguese stakeholder platform focused on Maritime Pine or Pinus pinaster, as you wish to call it. At CCPB, we are always striving to learn more about this species. And we decided to promote an international webinar series to discuss success factors in maritime pine production. Today's webinar is dedicated to Australia, more specifically Western Australia. That is definitely a key region to visit and to follow up for any stakeholder who has a specific interest in maritime pine and in any conifer silviculture. Now I'd like to introduce today's speaker, Owen Donovan, Forest in Western Australia. Owen Donovan has a university degree in conservation and land management and has over 30 years of professional experience both in the private and public sector. He was involved in management and plantation of Pinus pinaster areas for more than 20 years, was responsible for over 10,000 acres of new plantations in low rainfall areas. Hi Owen, I invite you now to join us by turning on your camera, microphone, and I'd like to start by thanking you for making time to share your expertise with us. Hello, Owen.
Good morning, Maria, or good evening from Western Australia. It's good to have the opportunity here to talk to you and share some information.
In the name of the center, we would like to thank you for making time to do this presentation, to share with us your knowledge and your expertise. And maybe now we can start with the presentation, if you'd like, Owen.
No problems, I'll just share it on the screen.
Great.
Thank you.
Great picture. Thank you.
Thanks for giving us this opportunity. I guess I wanted to try and share some of the information that we've got from Western Australia because I visited Portugal on a couple of occasions and seen pinaster growing in Portugal and in Spain and also in France. And I think what we have over here in Western Australia is just a little bit different, and maybe we've got a different culture with forestry. So hopefully the people watching this will find some of this interesting and some of it informative.
I'm sure we will. It's a fact, and we already met here in Portugal, I think back in 2006. And it's very important to share, and that's why we had this initiative to do these webinars so that we can share and experiences with the other realities. Like I said, we had the other 3 seminars, 2 from Spain and another from France. And once you know the reality in these countries, I think it's good because you can do the parallel and do the comparison between the realities. So thank you, Owen.
No worries. Well, I'll start on the presentation and yeah, feel free to prompt me or ask me questions as I run through the slides. I'll start with a little bit of a background. So where I'm from is Western Australia, which is the western third of our island continent. It's a large area, as big as pretty much all of Western Europe, but we have no population. So we only have 2.5 million people in an area as big as Western Europe. We also have a very flat landscape with virtually no hills. We have no snow and no real cold weather. We really don't experience a winter compared to Portugal and Spain. That has some advantages. It also has some disadvantages, as our local markets or demand for timber is actually really small, and pretty much a lot of what we do has to be exported to the other side of Australia or around the world, because we have very few people for demand for timber. The main timber species that was growing here naturally in the state is Eucalyptus marginata, or locally we call it jarrah. It's grown here for a very long time. The timber looks an awful lot like African mahogany. It's got a very dark, rich red colour. It's a very durable, strong timber. But with the harvesting of that timber in the 1800s and the early 1900s, the foresters as early as the 1920s could see that that wasn't a sustainable cut, and there would need to be a supplement with some Pinus species at some stage to supplement the harvesting of the eucalyptus. These foresters, sorry. So that's a picture showing a bit of, if you like, typical jarrah forest. It's a very mixed forest. Have some large diameter trees, possibly up to 2 meters in diameter, and then often some much smaller stems and a lot of regeneration. This image is a satellite image of the state of Western Australia. The generally white area there is the cleared farming land. So we have around 20 million hectares of cleared farming land and about 2.5 million hectares of existing forest estate. And the forest estate is all in the richer soils and the high rainfall area closer to the coast. Pinaster pine was planted here in the state back in about the 1920s was when it was started, and it was planted in an area that we call Nangara Pine Plantation, and it was actually planted in some of the city areas, but the city has grown large now and those earlier plantations have been removed for housing. Pinaster was chosen as the species because we have a very sandy soil here. So often on the coastal plain where we plant Pinaster, the sand can be up to 1 kilometre deep. It's often a very white, very infertile sand, holds very little nutrients, and there are no timber species often growing on that white sandy soil. The sandy soil has what we call a Banksia heath, which is a generally low 4 to 5 metre high Proteaceae species. Pinaster proved itself early on, back in about the 1920s to 1940s, as to be a lot more durable on the sandy soil, and it could handle the long droughts that we had in summer here. The normal Pinus species, I guess, around the world for production is radiata. On this white sandy soil, radiata really struggles with the lack of nutrients, the long summer drought, and it also can't handle low intensity fires. The problem with the early Pinaster that the foresters brought to WA was it generally had poor form. Most of the early Pinaster up until about the 1940s was from the Lons strain from France. But after some provenance trials and other arboretum that were planted in the early days, it was seen that the Portuguese Pinaster was superior. Now this machine is running a little bit slow here. In 1964, we had a forester called Dick Perry, and he was actually sent to Portugal for 2 years to start a plus tree selection in the Lieria forest, because it was seen that the Portuguese Pinaster was the best suited to our climate and soils in Western Australia. And through some investigation and I think some correspondence and investigation by Dick Perry, it was found that the Lieria forest contains some of the best stands of Pinaster. There's a couple of pictures there of Dick Perry in Portugal in the 1960s, but unfortunately the records are a bit scratchy, so I don't actually know the Portuguese people that he's standing with. From the 1960s on, there was another 30 years of tree breeding with pinaster, and that was generally led by a forester that we had here called Trevor Butcher, who retired quite a few years ago from the forestry department. But a lot of Dick Perry's work and Trevor Butcher's work led to some massive gains with the pinaster. And this attached graph here just shows the percentage gains in, sorry, I'll go back. The graph there just shows the percentage gains in volume growth per annum that were achieved with the pinaster breeding. And it's gone through a few generations of breeding. We often talk about the first generation pinaster, which was produced for commercial seed quantities back in around 1970. And since then, I believe we're now at the third generation of pinaster. The next slide here shows the difference. This is one of the earlier trial plantings showing unimproved pinaster from the Portuguese strain. And that's the difference with the first generation pinaster in its production. So you can see it's a vastly different tree. In working in the forest here, in the plantations that we have, it's quite easy to see the change in around 1970 going from unimproved pinaster to the improved pinaster. And certainly everything that's been planted up to, say, the 1980s and early 90s, you can see that the form of the trees on a lot of the older sites is actually perfect.
It's impressive. Owen, you hadn't, sorry, but like you said, it's better if we do a conversation. Like you said, you had a 140% of increase since in the 140% of increase in volume production?
Yeah, in volume growth per annum from unimproved stock to the latest generation, it's a 140% increase in volume. Plus there's a significant a significant decrease in branch size. The angle of the branches tends to be a lot flatter, and the newer pinaster is very straight. You don't tend to get that bowl sweep that you have with the unimproved stock, and the bowl sweep that we seem to have a lot of with the French variety, which a lot of the early plantings here with the Lon strain put people, if you like, a little bit off pinaster because it all tends to have a lot of bowl sweep. This new generation pinaster is very straight, which makes for better utilisation and less waste. In the 60s in this state, we had a pretty big push with Pinus plantations. A lot of it was radiata and some of it was pinaster on what was seen as the poor or harsher sites. So in about the late 60s, there were quite a few arboretums planted from the northern part of the farming area all the way through to the richer soils in the eucalypt forest, just to see which would be the best performing Pinus species, and on a few sites some eucalypt species. Out of that, the forest department at the time pretty much ran with two species, which was Pinus radiata for the richer clay loam sites with high rainfall, and anything that was lower rainfall with a sandy soil tended to be planted to Pinus pinaster. Now, the next slide shows, this is sort of typical of about 10 or 15,000 hectares of plantation that we used to have north of Perth. That was the standard sort of stocking, if you like, and also the standard form of the pinaster trees, because these are all from that first generation. Which, compared to what I've seen in Portugal, and Spain and France, this is virtually a different tree. This shows, to show some of the pressures that we have on the plantation. One of the pressures that we have into a lot of the pinaster plantation is housing development. So a lot of what used to be old plantation near the city area and closer to the city has slowly been turned into residential areas. So some of the original plantation areas have completely gone. The original pinaster that was planted, say from the 1920s to the 1940s on some of the infertile sites, we have some really slow growth rates. So mean annual increments of maybe 1 cubic metre per year. So very, very slow. Definitely something that wouldn't be seen as commercial on a site in this state. With the tree breeding and actually moving on to more ex-farmland sites that have some fertiliser history, we have MAIs now of up to 12 cubic metres a year, but typically it's quite easy to have MAIs of around 8 plus with this pinaster. And that's on actually quite low rainfall sites to what you'd have in Portugal. So most of the sites that we have it planted on are between about 500 mil and 700 mil rainfall. And I've put in a few little snippets here on our climate that we have. So our climate, from what I've experienced in Europe, is very similar to south of Lisbon, well south of Lisbon and southern Spain. We have a very long drought, quite easily on a lot of the areas of 6 months with no rainfall. The middle of summer, we can have temperatures in excess of 37 degrees, sometimes temperatures in excess of 40 plus degrees for many days on a row, and extremely low humidities and quite strong desert winds in the morning, and then a coastal breeze in the afternoon. One thing that's very different with our climate here is we don't have snow. If I want to see snow or walk in snow, usually I'd have to drive 2,000 kilometres to go to the other side of Australia, because our winter climate here, we just don't have the cold temperatures. Occasionally small frosts in valleys and the like, but the days that we have frost, we usually have a maximum temperature of around 20 degrees. And as I put in the slide here, we have no altitude. We don't plant anything on mountains. We don't actually have mountains. Generally, the highest altitude in that southwest of the state is about 400 metres above sea level. This was just to reiterate how hot it gets over here. It's very easy for us to have temperatures of around 46 degrees. Above that, it starts to get a little bit crazy, and people start to get a little bit crazy. So one thing that happened here with the pinaster plantings is up until about the 1980s, pretty much all the plantation estate was planted onto government land, which for quite a while was generally native vegetation that was cleared or harvested for timber, and then it was planted into pine plantations. In around the 1980s into 1990s, that was seen as not environmentally the right thing to do, and the government started doing pine plantings on farms. And this was down to the 400 mil rainfall zone with pines. And part of those plantings were, they were driven as to produce, if you like, a commercial crop, provide an environmental benefit by using up some excess water in the landscape, and seen as a long-term carbon sink, although what we experienced from the 1990s to now is too much uncertainty with the carbon market to actually make that part of it come to fruition. By planting on the ex-farm sites, what we found with the early years of growth as we were having very rapid growth with the pinaster. So at ages 2 to 5, we were getting growth of up to 1.5 metres per year in top height with pinaster, which was really unusual because on the ex-native bush sites that had been planted for the previous 30 years, we were used to a growth rate of about 0.5 metre per year with pinaster. So this was a tripling of the top height per year on sites that had much lower rainfall. We were only using improved seed or orchard seed, but what we found was that the lower rainfall sites, because they'd only held very poor pasture prior to planting, actually seemed to have a lot of soil moisture built up in them and a lot of phosphate and other fertilisers built up in the soil.
Impressive.
It's impressive growth. It was quite common at age 3 to have trees that were 2 to 3 metres plus and growing very rapidly. The downside of that is we'd taken a tree that had been used to growing slow and suddenly gave it too much nutrient and a lot of water, and it started to grow a little bit too quick. So we lost some of the form games with the rapid growth. Back when this share farming or farm planting really took off in the 1990s, the state had its own tree nursery, which could grow a massive volume of trees for Pinus pinaster planting, and at the same time there was a massive boom here with planting Eucalyptus globulus, which before, say, about 1990 had never really been planted in this side of Australia because it's a tree that grows on the other side of the country. So over this 15 years, there was about 20,000 hectares of pinaster planted under contract with landowners. There's been a little bit more planted since then, but that was, if you like, the boom time for us planting pinaster, and when the program had a lot more government funding and support for tree breeding and research into it. The plans were quite grand. At the time, I think the plan was to plant something in the order of 200,000 hectares of pinaster through the farming area in the southwest of Western Australia. Sounded like a very big plan at the time, but it only took, I think it was about 10 years for us to have somewhere around 250,000 hectares of globulus plantation planted in the farming area. So this plan of a lot of pinaster on the poorer soils seemed to have good merit. The image that I have up there sort of shows that typical planting that would be put on a property would be to follow the deep sandy soils, if you like, in the bottom of old drainage lines. So a typical farm here in Western Australia would be 1,000 to 3,000 hectares. And typically on a property, we would plant maybe 100 or 200 hectares of pinaster in a season. Now, this is a little graph just to show that for a very long time there was very little planting in the state. In fact, up until about the 1970s, the government had a fairly big push for farmers to clear land, to clear native vegetation and actually put it into grazing or into cropping. And it wasn't until around that 1970s and beyond that tree planting started to grow some momentum. Now, for some reason, that one seems to have stuck, but it's finally moved. So today, the state has around 75,000 hectares of Pinus plantation. The majority of that's radiata because it's in the better soils and high rainfall in the southwest. There's still around 30,000 hectares of pinaster left, but there hasn't been new pinaster plantings, most probably for about 7 years.
Sorry, Owen, and I don't know if you maybe you are talking about, but why are not planting at this moment? There
was a large push by the federal and state government from about 1980 through to around 2010 to do a lot of tree establishment on farms, partly to fix up some of the land care problems we have with rising salinity and soil erosion and rising water tables. In around 2010, there was a change of government policy, and the plantings, if you like, were left more to private industry to establish. The hard thing here for private industry to establish tree crops is, on a world scale, we have fairly slow growth rates in some of the low rainfall sites that we have and poor soils. So the return can be quite low. So private companies also growing trees here. We only have a few local sawmills that operate in the state. So if they want to sell to anyone else, they really have to export it, and to export, you really have to be in a massive scale, like we have with the blue gum industry, where it's hundreds of thousands of tons a year. And to get up that scale, it's a massive investment in a country where pretty much all of the cleared land is owned by individual farmers. So it's a lot of negotiation, a lot of contracts that a company would have to put together to get in a larger state. So the scale of the plantings that used to happen under the share farm agreements were generally 20 to up to 400 hectares per property. So it'd be one contract with one landowner for that area, which I know it sounds very easy compared to what you have in Portugal and Spain, because that sort of scale doesn't exist. And you can see from that photo that generally the sites that we were planting on were extremely flat and very clean, virtually no rocks, just nice deep sand, very easy to run machines through and do machine planting, which was good because the machine planting brings down the costs, and it also increases the survival rate of the trees, because we're planted onto very dry sands. The deeper you plant the trees, the better the survival will become. So this is an image just showing typical 3-year-old pinaster in about 500 mil rainfall zone. And when I say 500 mil, it doesn't really compare to, say, 500 mil in maybe Spain, where you get quite a long winter and a mild spring and a cool autumn. We have a winter that starts in about May, and usually by September things are starting to go dry. October, all the grass has died in the paddocks, and it stays dead all the way through until the next May. So the summer is really harsh and long. Now this is just showing the left-hand photo there. That's pinaster that's about 20 years old, out on a site that only has 500 mil rainfall, but the pinaster has access to a water table. And you can see there with the distance between the knot whorls that we're typically getting 1 metre to 1.5 metre growth per annum. So this stand that's now 20 years old, there's a lot more competition in the stand, but the top height of that pinaster is up around that 25 metre mark, and it's most probably holding somewhere in the order of about 120, maybe 140 tonnes per hectare. So it's holding quite a thick stand of wood. In contrast, the more open stand there is typical of what we had in the older plantations, where we had much slower growth rates and also much heavier thinnings to try and promote early sawlog in the plantation. then we get to even more extremes. Both these pictures are in stands that are about 15 years old, and you can see by the canopy closure and also the needle bed on the ground that we've got a really high MAI on these sites. And again, they're pinaster sites on low rainfall, but there is some access to a water table below, which is giving us that extra growth. Now, I've got a few slides here just to show a little bit about the harvesting of pinaster. So something that I've noticed that we've done a little bit different to possibly Europe is back even in the 1990, we were machine harvesting all pinaster. And it's been all machine harvesting from 1990 until today. We don't have any hand fallers operating in any of the pinaster plantations. Everything is by machine. And part of the reason for that, I think, is because Australia, we're lucky over here. We have good wages and we have no population. So with good wages and no population, it's very hard to actually try and find a large crew to be able to do hand falling and the like. And what we used to find is in our summer extremes, very hard for people hand falling and the like when the temperature's up around 40 degrees. The machine harvester, one machine can probably replace about 12 or 14 people, keep working through the hot days and also keep working through the rain. And from a fire control point of view, the machine harvesting was also better because as the machine harvests and then walks over the tops of the trees, it crushes everything down, which really reduces the fire risk until we can get a controlled burn through that plantation later on. Before I forget, the pinaster plantation that we have based around Perth has been producing about 120,000 cubic metres a year of mainly laminated veneer lumber. And we've also had some domestic and some export chip production. The hard thing about being such a remote place is 15, 20 years ago, the chip mill that we had up near the city of Perth closed down and moved away, which sort of took away the chip market that we had for early thinnings in pinaster. This is just to show that how impressive some of the timber production has been out of our forests here. These are much older trees, planted possibly as far back as the 1940s. But you can see with the diameters here, we've got trees, some of them, well up to over a metre in diameter. And I know compared to a lot of the pinaster that's grown through Europe, this would be seen as rapid growth and really large log volume. I've thrown just a couple of nice pictures in here just to prove to people how good the form is of pinaster and how uniform it is. And it is really easy to see this as a typical stand of pinaster. There's one other thing that we have here that is really different that foresters that have visited us notice straight away is we have no pine cones on any trees. And we have a parrot, it's a black cockatoo, which is a really large parrot. And it goes through and removes all the pine cones off 20,000 hectares of pinaster every year, and it's one of its main food sources now. Which is fine for the parrot, but it's very hard for the foresters that are trying to harvest seeds from the pinaster because the seed orchards need to be protected from the parrot to stop them from taking away all the seed cones.
I remember hearing about that seed orchards. It's a big problem to maintain the cones, and you had like a horn system to put away the parrots.
We do. We have gas guns which scare the parrots away. One thing that's happened is a lot of the development around the city and clearing of land for farming has taken away a lot of the food source for the parrots. So Now the parrot is actually also a threatened species, so the pinaster is a very important food source for that parrot. This is often a photo that gets foresters wondering what we're up to. Because everything is so flat here and we have large distances, we're sort of used to road train, we call it, transport, which is it's not one truck, it's actually two trucks joined together. It moves double the volume of wood, but with only one person driving the truck. And it's just a standard way that we've seen timber harvested now around the state for probably about 20 or more years. Something that I think would be very hard to do in Portugal with the hills that you have there and some of the narrow roads you have.
Yes, impossible.
Again, this is another pic just to show just how impressive some of our older pinaster stands are, with really large trees, and you can see the growth rings, the spacing in them there, that they're actually growing very rapidly, with very, no real constraints on them. We do have a little bit of what I like to call European establishment. So in some places now we have, now that the pinaster has been removed from some of the sites closer to the city, we actually have some natural seeding from the old pine stands, and we have these, we call them pine wilding areas, where the seeds are just coming up, if you like, naturally. But to us over here, it's a weed. It's not a natural occurrence. It's actually seen as a weed, although we have started to protect some of these stands now because they're seen as a future food source for the black cockatoo. Now the next couple of slides I've got is a little bit different, just showing a little bit of the fire and how one thing that we do very differently in Western Australia is our planned burning or controlled burning regime that we have through the eucalypt forest and also through the pine plantations. So this photo is of one of the sort of worst fires that we've had in the last 15 years. It took out over 1,000 hectares of plantation in a day. But you can see the area that's been fully defoliated where the crown fire came through. And either side of that were areas that had been controlled burnt either 6 months before the fire or 1 year before the fire. And over again with the fires that we've had through the plantation, we've seen the benefits of the controlled burning. It's one of the best ways that we have of protecting the plantations. Although fire hasn't been the biggest risk to the plantation, possibly the biggest risk has been drought. With us planting pinaster out into lower rainfall sites and newer sites and delayed first thinnings on sites, there's been considerable drought on areas that have had delayed thinnings. And part of that is because we lack a local chip market. So anything that we do, well, not everything that we do, but a lot of what happens is export chip. So the burn program that we had was developed around, if you like, an old goal, which was the government had a plan to plant a very large area of plantation north of the city. The only way that plantation area could be protected from fire was to burn up to 5,000 hectares of it a year. So under pine burning, mild, cool burns in the middle of winter. So for us over here, that's burning in June, July and August. We used to do up to 5,000 hectares a year. That's a mix of needle bed burning, red tops, and some of it was clear fell. Generally, we do that by hand. I'll just click onto the next slide to show an image of that. So the majority of what we burn is by people just walking through the plantation, putting a mile burn through like that. Each person does about 25 hectares per day. Some of the time we can use a vehicle-mounted flamethrower, which increases the scale of what we do. Then we can do 200 or 300 hectares a day per vehicle. Or 15, 20 years ago, when we had a much bigger plantation estate, occasionally we'd also bring in a helicopter and we'd do aerial ignition. So on days when we'd have aerial ignition, we might be able to burn 1,000 or 1,500 hectares a day. Today, because we have a lot less plantation and it's a lot more fragmented across the landscape, we don't have the need as much to do helicopter burning, and most of what we do is by hand, because it's a cheaper per hectare way of burning, and it's a much easier way of controlling smoke and disturbance to neighbours. Without underpine burning, it wouldn't be possible for us to grow pinaster in our climate. Our summers are so hot and so windy and so dry. If we didn't underpine burn, we would have no pinaster left now. It would have all been burnt over the last 20 years. We don't have the problem that Portugal has with ignitions per year. We have a different culture of fire over here, but we still have enough accidental and deliberate ignitions that they're a risk to plantation.
But we are on the risk. The main problem is fire, and we are losing most of the area. So more and more we have peaks of hot summers and days with very high temperature. We are realizing that it's a fact, and windy, and okay, so moments that all the things put together to have bigger and bigger fires each year.
We have had some big pine fires here. Certainly fuel reduction burning, that's been the biggest thing that we've had that saved the pines, and we actually do fuel reduction burning in our natural eucalypt forests as well. So we have a different culture, I think, in this state to fire than the rest of Australia has, and certainly the rest of the world. One thing I experienced though in Portugal is a lot of foresters told me that if we did too much pine burning and made the ground bare, it would damage the roots of the trees and disease would come in or insects would attack. We don't have the same insect pests that you have in Europe, and we don't have the same diseases. So we can underpine burn and actually leave the ground quite bare, as you can see in this slide, and there's no detriment to the pine growth at all. The one thing we have to watch is to make sure conditions are nice and mild and we don't have scorch and start, removing some of the crown of the trees. But certainly on the ground, you can have, 80, 90% of the needle bed completely removed in a warm burn or a windy burn, and the pinaster seems to thrive from it. Now, only a couple of slides left. One is to show that we also have a fire problem here. When we have fire in a plantation area that has been recently harvested and has a lot of fuel on the ground and it's a bad day, we get these sort of extreme conditions, which I know Portugal has had a lot of over the last few years. And on a bad day with high fuel loadings, the best aircraft, dozers, anything in the world can't stop it. It's just uncontrollable. Now that is the end of my presentation here. I hope you found it of interest. And as one of my colleagues is doing here now and again, it's good to hug a pinaster, the perfect pine as we call it over here.
Okay, thank you very much. Great presentation to give us the reality of your plantations of Pinus pinaster. Good for us. It's also to see that the seeds that started that perfect pine that this picture illustrate, hugging the perfect pine, started here in Portugal, no? The seed selection.
And thanks for letting me do the presentation in English, because my Portuguese is absolutely terrible. So yeah, thanks for letting me do that.
Now we have to thank you. So we have to thank you your availability and giving us your time to do this and to allow us to learn a little bit more.